the American people, really the majority of the American people, have placed a value on the policy of ensuring that our farmers and ranchers can stay in business.
I think we're at a really historic moment based on the House Reconciliation Bill. If it becomes law, I think it resets kind of our fundamental understanding of Farm Bill politics, and then that will necessarily reset what policy looks like.
Welcome back to the On Land Podcast, where we explore the people and ideas shaping the future of the American West. Today, we're talking about the Farm Bill, a piece of legislation that quietly shapes much of life in this country, especially for those of us in rural America. Renewed roughly every 5 years, the Farm Bill influences everything from food access to conservation, crop insurance to rural infrastructure. And yet, for how far-reaching it is, most Americans know very little about what's actually in it, or what's at stake when it comes up for renewal. To help unpack the history, the politics, and the uncertain path ahead, Lesli Allison, our CEO here at Western Landowners Alliance, speaks with two people who've helped shape past farm bills and ag policy from both sides of the aisle, Joel Leftwich and Jonathan Coppess. I'm Zach Altman, and this is On Land.
All right. Well, welcome to the On Land Podcast. We're super excited today to talk about something that really helps shape a lot of American life, but that many Americans really don't know very much about. It's actually the federal Farm Bill, and it's been part of American life and politics for the last 90 years. And the first Farm Bill became law in 1935. And the Farm Bill's been reauthorized roughly every 5 years since that time. During this podcast today, we are going to be talking with two former high-ranking staffers who served in the Senate Agriculture Committee. Jonathan Coppess, former chief counsel under former Senator and Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow, a Democrat from Michigan, and Joel Leftwich, a former staff director under former Senator and Chairman Pat Roberts, a Republican from Kansas. And I'm very excited for this conversation because there's a potentially big change coming to the way the Farm Bill gets written and passed. And Joel and Jonathan are here to help us all get up to speed. So let's welcome our two guests. And I'd like to ask you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the role you played on the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. And Jonathan, let's kick off with you.
Well, that's not fair.
Alphabetical.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been a while since Joel and I got to collaborate on anything, since we've both been in exile from Capitol Hill for a couple of years now. So to answer your question, I'm at the University of Illinois, where I have the good fortune of being an associate professor of agricultural policy, which allows me to nerd out, be a complete policy geek on things like the history of Farm Bill and how policies and programs have come about and developed over time. Prior to that, like you said, I was on the Senate Ag Committee working sometimes with Joel, sometimes against Joel, depending on the day, the moment, the issue. I also spent time, I was in D.C. at the Department of Ag, USDA, and Farm Service Agency, or the main agency that assists farmers, payments and that sort of thing. I worked for Ben Nelson prior to that from Nebraska, which is where Joel and I met. And I'll let him tell the story of our first interaction over the Republican River in Nebraska, Kansas. We got a little bit in the Nebraska-Kansas war, many decades of disputes. I am a recovering attorney. I practiced law in Chicago before going to DC. I went to law school at George Washington University. And then way back, I grew up on a farm in Ohio. So my family, kind of standard issue corn soybean farm in Western Ohio. But I'm such a difficult human being. They kicked me off and never let me back. So I've been wandering ever since in the wilds of policy and now academia. But that's my sob story. I'll stick to it, hand it over to the Honorable Mr. Leftwich.
I like how you didn't use air quotes when you said honorable this time. Thank you, Lesli, for the opportunity to be with you today. Since Jonathan mentioned it, I will tell the story first and apologize. You're going to get a bunch of stories. So when I first met Jonathan Coppess, I was working for Senator Roberts as a legislative assistant, working in agriculture and stuff. And our bosses had a bill together that was critical to the history and the success of our nation. It was about extending a loan guarantee, a federal loan for a water issue. And we're getting ready to clear it late one night. We cleared it from the Republican side, and there was an objection on the Democrat side that had to be cleared. I hadn't met this guy yet other than over email. Our bosses were on this bill together, and it's 10 o'clock at night or whatever. And I get the call that says, you got to find this guy, Jonathan Coppess, in Senator Nelson's office to figure out what's going on the Democrat side. So I had to find his home phone number from a phone book. I call him and I'm like, hey, this is Joel from Senator Roberts' office. You got a problem on your side. You guys need to fix it. And he was not very pleased with me for calling him at home at 10 or 10:30 at night, interrupting his sleep.
You missed a detail in there. My wife answered. And
yeah, that's true.
She had to find me, and she was like, I don't know what this is about, but it's 10 o'clock at night, and somebody's calling from Roberts' office. It's like, oh crap.
So I grew up here in Kansas. My name's Joel Leftwich. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Kansas Farm Bureau. I've been in this position for about 4 years. And like Jonathan, I'm a recovering kind of DC policy person. I did not grow up on a farm. I'm an SOB, son of a banker. But I grew up in a small town in the south central part of the state and got to know agriculture through the lens of my dad, who was a lender, and my mom, who worked for our church. So when ag had a good year, the bank had a good year, the church had a good year, the town had a good year. I ended up in D.C. I worked for USDA for a little while in the George W. Bush administration, and then spent a lot of time with Senator Pat Roberts in his office. But I also worked in the private sector in D.C. in ag policy. I worked for PepsiCo for a while, and then for a consulting firm where our clients were food and agriculture businesses, kind of big to small. Then we moved back here to Kansas a little bit later in life, my wife and I did. So happy to be with you here. My time on the Senate Ag Committee was when Senator Roberts was ranking member. I was the deputy staff director, and that's where Jonathan and I went head to head and shoulder to shoulder on a lot of things. Then when he became chairman, I became his first staff director, where we built up the office and started him in those first 2 years on a great pathway to being chairman. And I have to say, all of us Roberts folks have it tattooed on our backs. Very pleased to work for Senator Roberts, who was the only person in history to serve as chairman and ranking member of the same committee in both the House and the Senate. So he was ranking member and chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, and then again in the Senate. And so we wear that with pride and distinction because it tells you about who he is and his passion for agriculture and farmers and ranchers.
Yeah, a true force in the whole situation. Well, it's so wonderful to have you both here and your expertise. And today, as I said in the introduction, we're going to be talking about the Farm Bill, which is one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in the country, but one which most Americans actually seem to know very little about. And in fact, I tell a little story. I was in a Senate Finance Committee hearing shortly after the passage of the last Farm Bill. And I brought it up in my testimony and said, hey, just so you know, Farm Bill just passed. And there were two members of the Senate Finance Committee in the legislature, which shall remain unnamed as far as the state, who said, what's the Farm Bill? And I will say it's a state that depends very heavily on the Farm Bill. So that was a little shocking. But if our Senate Finance Committee legislators don't know about it, most Americans don't. And I used to manage a ranch for about 16 years. And I had just the vaguest idea of how it interwove into our lives where I was operating. So what I'm hoping you guys can do is talk a little bit about the history and the significance of the Farm Bill, how it really does affect American life, what it is and how it came into being, and then maybe just some of the critical inflection points.
I'm deferring to you, Jonathan, since you've written a book on this, or two. Only one of them has a reference to me in it, so there's only one that matters.
Just two. The history is, the first one really is 1933, and that's Great Depression. So all of the Farm Bill starts as New Deal era, like response to an emergency crisis. 1936, Dust Bowl, we get kind of a first taste of trying to do conservation and address some of the challenges on farming. The big changes that really happen are next in 1973. And so you kind of have the 70s reorientation of policy around making direct payments, but also bringing in the food assistance program, then called food stamps, now the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. The next big kind of turning point is 1985. Congressman Pat Roberts was a key player in that Farm Bill. That's the one that permanently authorized conservation policy, particularly the Conservation Reserve Program. It also made some subtle changes to some of the price support programs that tried to get out of kind of the messes we'd seen for decades. And then again, not to overplay the role of Pat Roberts, but as chairman, Pat Roberts was the author of the 1996 Farm Bill, which at that point in time was certainly the biggest set of changes to farm policy, in which we decouple. So they separated the payments from farmers' planting decisions, set in motion a 7-year fixed contract payment, and kind of reoriented the policy. And then, Joel, because we're here together, the next biggest change was the one we helped to write, which is the 2014 Farm Bill, which eliminated the direct payments and kind of set us in this newer policy kind of direction around revenue and price-based payments. But that's kind of the rough overview. The last one that was reauthorized was 2018, and we're in this wonderful holding pattern because Congress hasn't been able to reauthorize it, so it's extended. And then in a state of kind of limbo because of the budget reconciliation stuff that's working through the House. But that's kind of my quick history of the Farm Bill.
What kind of numbers are we talking about? We talked about the food stamp, SNAP, direct payments. How big is this thing?
So, and Joel will get a chuckle because the way we measure policy is over 10 fiscal years. So the Congressional Budget Office looks at these things in a 10-year kind of look ahead, what we call baseline, which is, trying to project into the future for 10 years, which, is impossible. But the basic baseline for a farm bill is roughly over $1 trillion. And about 80% of that goes through food assistance. So you're looking at any year around $100 to $110 billion for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which used to be food stamps. And that's helping somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45 million households put food on the table. So it's a big program. And then the other about 20 billion or so a year is direct assistance to farmers through things like the subsidy payments, conservation, and then the offset of the cost of crop insurance. So we subsidize the premium cost to the farmer. And those are the big bucket items. There's a whole bunch of other programs that spend money as well, but we tend to think of it in the congressional space of these 10-year kind of blocks of what we think it's going to spend, or what the Congressional Budget Office thinks it's going to spend.
Joel, do you want to jump in on any of that?
There's a reason he's written books, right? I found that a lot of times in my interactions with Jonathan, I will just make statements and then he'll come back and fact check me. And it just depends on if you like his facts or not. I didn't quite hear him say it, though. Who was the author of that 2018 Farm Bill? Jonathan, I didn't hear you.
What was the House?
Who was the chair of the Senate?
Pat Roberts.
Oh, yeah, there it was. Sorry.
Yes.
I get $1 every time I make him say that name. So, yeah, I think it's interesting, when you look over time at that change in policy, that change in direction, a lot of it is preceded by a change in attitude of folks who don't, to your point earlier, Leslie, who don't really know what's in a farm bill. So even, when Jonathan mentioned that 2014 Farm Bill, a lot of that movement to shift away from the direct payment program that was built in essentially in 1996 was because there was this sentiment to kind of move away from that guaranteed support that came there. There was a lot of fiscal attention being paid to the Farm Bill. And so that eventually got moved to a price support, price and revenue type of support system. Similarly, in 1996, there was a move to, as John said, to decouple this. There was a great concern that the World Trade Organization was going to look at our programs. If you look at 20 years between 96 and the next change, like where did our programs put us in the world of trade? Did it bring unwarranted attention to our farm programs? We were also pursuing cases against other countries in the World Trade Organization for unfair subsidy programs regarding agriculture. And so I think a lot of that global trade kind of concern influenced where our own policy was. So it's interesting to look not just at where the policy changed over time, but what were the causes, what were the conditions around those policy changes that forced Congress to make a shift in their priorities.
Let's dive in a little bit on the subsidy question. I had a professor from an East Coast college come out a summer or two ago, and she said to me, we people in the urban areas are pretty tired of subsidizing you people in the rural areas. We hear that quite a bit. And we also even hear, an aversion from within the agricultural community. They don't want to be perceived as taking subsidies. There's a lot of judgment around subsidies and not a lot of understanding around why we have the subsidies. So why do we subsidize farms and ranches and our agricultural economy?
Yeah, so my former boss, I think probably every segment, Leslie, you're going to hear a quote from Pat Roberts. So after the 96 bill, my boss gave an interview to George Will, who was working for the Wall Street Journal at the time, and he asked a very similar question. He's like, we don't subsidize, widget makers out there. And my boss at the time, very quickly, and if you know him, you can see it. He very quickly says, when's the last time you put a widget between two slices of bread and ate it? Like what our farmers and ranchers produce is pretty different than what other manufacturers have to produce. Those farmers and ranchers are facing challenges every day with Mother Nature, with international markets, and a lot of times with their own elected officials getting in their way. Let alone you have consumers on the other end who influence food manufacturers and the ingredients that they purchase. And the American people, really the majority of the American people, have placed a value on the policy of ensuring that our farmers and ranchers can stay in business, have placed a value on the policies that ensure that rural communities stay intact. And I imagine a lot of your listeners are from rural communities and face a lot of challenges. When we talk about the Farm Bill, it's not just the supports that are there for our producers, but you look at the Rural Development Program. Rural Development at USDA is the only office, I think, in the federal government that can take a brownfield site and turn it into a town. They have programs that can do everything from infrastructure to community loans to business loans, whatever it is, to take barren desert and turn it into a town, if there's a will or a need to do that. I mean, the amount of resources and authorities within the Department of Agriculture are vast. And I think, to your point, a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah. There's a saying that every good business reinvests in the resources that sustain it, right? You've got to make those investments to keep your resource strong. And here in the United States, working lands are a critical resource to national security, national well-being, and there has to be some level of co-investment in those resources. We can't lean as heavily on the working lands and the resources they provide without bringing some support to make sure that those resources stay available to us, continue to support everything really in our lives. And my experience is that people further and further away from the land tend to lose touch with where the food comes from, where the building materials come from that create the shelters that we live in, where our energy comes from, all of those kinds of things. It doesn't come from the store or the mall or the gas station. It comes from out on these working lands. And so we tend to think of it as a co-investment, as a whole of society investment in sustaining the kinds of resources and quality of life that we need, because you can't put that on the shoulders of one rancher or farmer or a small community to do. It is a whole of society investment. So we actually don't like the term subsidies. I feel is sometimes misleading in how we think about these things. And co-investment and partnership is really another way to describe what we're doing here with the Farm Bill. And there's been clearly strong bipartisan support over the years. I'd be curious, maybe Joel, when you think about the politics of the Farm Bill, why has it been unique in that regard? And are we seeing a kind of that dynamic shift right now in the last decade or so? And if so, why are we seeing that shift?
I'd say traditionally, there's been a lot of bipartisanship that has passed final farm bills. It's also not uncommon. My first job in politics was working for a member of the House of Representatives. All right. And then I worked for the Senate later on. And so I don't want to get into this big. Coppess will understand this kind of from the staff side, a House side versus Senate side from a staffer perspective. But they're just very different entities with very different rules. And so usually, when a farm bill goes through the House of Representatives on the first take, right, it's their bill, they've written it, it's a pretty partisan vote. If you look back, certainly to recent, that majority is very narrow. If Republicans are in control, you're going to lose 10 to 20 Republicans are going to vote no on a farm bill, right? And then if you don't have that cushion of Democrats to step up and vote yes, it's really, really difficult to pass a farm bill. We've seen farm bills fall in recent history on the House floor because they've been too partisan. The Senate is able to take a bit more of a bipartisan approach because in the Senate, whether it's Republicans or Democrats in the majority, you're not going to get every single one of your party to vote yes, and you got to get 60 votes, right? And no party has had a 60 vote majority in quite some time. So you've got to work in a bipartisan fashion. Even the 2018 Farm Bill was very narrow majority in the House. House Republicans passed it. Larger majority, one of the largest bipartisan votes in the Senate. And then the conference committee came back and, there was a wide bipartisan vote in the House. And so I think that, we'll still see that kind of ebb and flow, but it's getting more and more difficult, at least to get that initial farm bill passed on the House side in a bipartisan way.
So that's a good segue. Jonathan, you've talked a lot about the durability of Farm Bill policy. It's been reauthorized 19 times. Is that correct? That's a long time. So do you still see the Farm Bill as durable policy? And if not, does that become an opportunity to build some new coalitions and remake the Farm Bill? I mean, what happens at this juncture?
The short answer is I don't know. If this House reconciliation bill goes through, I don't know. I'm going to go into a bit of a geek path here for a second, because one of the things I think is fascinating about a farm bill, particularly when you dive into the history and a couple things about like how Congress works and sort of this kind of process that we have, this wonderful legislative process that the framers built into the Constitution for Congress and that we've, worked on for a couple hundred years now. And what I think is fascinating, because the Farm Bill is a window into this, right? That what we see in it is as much a coalition building exercise as the individual policies, and understanding how, like, okay, a small subset of farmers want a certain kind of payment. Well, they're not going to get the votes to do that. So what does the coalition look like? We have a strong interest out of some areas for helping low-income families get food, but others resist that. And so how do you build this coalition over time? And the history of this Farm Bill shows it. Like I was talking about from the early days in the 30s, where it was really just wheat, cotton, and corn interests in the Midwest, the Western Plains, and the South that wanted to see, they were pushing for support because of the Great Depression, and it got kind of lifted through Congress because of all the efforts in the New Deal to address the Great Depression. But as it falls apart, that's when we start to see food assistance come into the mix. And they say, okay, if we can, kind of work together and we help low income individuals get food assistance, then we pair that up with the farm assistance and we kind of move those things through. So I think it has a lot of lessons in how that works, which brings me to your question. We don't have a lot of experience with what happens when that gets torn apart, when you break that up. And Joel, I don't disagree with him necessarily. The House, at least some want to frame the House as always kind of, and it is, let's have fun with the House. If I was a little more unruly, the rules are different, the procedure's different, and it tends to have a lot more of that disagreement working it out. But I would also challenge that a little bit in that that's not the case every time, and that's not the case with all leadership in the House or all leadership at the committee level. And what I think we have seen, the other lesson I think we've seen in recent years, is how when we bring in budget, like when the whole talk is about spending, it's when we break this whole thing apart. And so we're seeing it in the reconciliation bill. We lived with it in 2011 when it was the pressure of the debt ceiling fight with the Tea Party caucus in the House. And so I do think there's some dynamics in there that complicate maintaining a coalition. It's really budget based. And I would argue that one of the unfortunate things is we get into this budget mindset and all we see are big numbers and we miss a lot of the nuances or a lot of the real policy components. So it's one thing to tell me that SNAP spends $100 billion a year. It's another thing to tell me that 40 million households get food put on their table because of that, right? And so that's a very different discussion when we think about it. But unfortunately, we get locked into this budget fight, these big numbers, and it becomes very partisan and we start to tear it apart. Which brings me back to my I don't know. Because we've seen 90 years in which in different ways, in different kind of efforts, we've built a coalition to do this. I don't think any of us know what it looks like if we use a budget process to break apart the coalition. Because where do you go next? To your question, right? What's the next coalition look like? Well, there's not something that matches food assistance and tens of millions of households that need help. There's not like this ready kind of new alliance to build, particularly if you've angered all the people who represent those that are struggling to put food on the table. So I think we are at a, looking historically, I think we're at a really historic moment based on the House reconciliation bill. If it becomes law, I think it resets kind of our fundamental understanding of Farm Bill politics. And then that will necessarily reset what policy looks like. Because for many years, like this coalition has worked in a manner that there's kind of an understanding that farm interests shouldn't change food policy and food policy interests shouldn't change farm policy. And we kind of have this basic understanding that we're not going to take from you to feed us and take from us to feed you. It's kind of that general coalitional understanding that This House bill in particular completely throws it out the window. It directly takes from food assistance to directly pay farmers. And I would argue that in some pretty egregious manners to pay farmers, ways in which I think will actually backfire or hurt farmers over the long term, and hurt agriculture over the long term. Part of it is to what Joel's saying, like, why do we do this to begin with? We want that productive capability. We want small towns that aren't hollowed out and destroyed. We want farmers to have new generations of farmers producing food and not lose all that in the mix of a payment game that this has really become. But these do play together, right? These do interact. And so a coalition is a, evolving thing. It continues. When you end it, we don't have, again, we don't have a playbook for starting over on that.
The Online Podcast is produced by the Western Landowners Alliance. In tumultuous times, we are the steady voice of landowners and land managers, helping policymakers chart a course for a whole and healthy West. Your gift helps make that voice louder. Give now at westernlandowners.org/support.
So can we just talk a little bit more, maybe help us understand in the current budget reconciliation process that's happening? So just for listeners who maybe not be tracking this as closely, like, budget reconciliation is a major focus in Congress right now. And it's a process that both Democrats and Republicans use when they have control of both the Senate, House, and the White House. And in the proposed bill right now, the House of Representatives in the reconciliation process, there's included some portions of the Farm Bill and then some not portions of the Farm Bill, right? So it begins to look like maybe it's breaking apart the Farm Bill. So, Joel, I don't know if you'd like to expound on that any further, what you see, what happens when pieces get included and other pieces get excluded? What would be next?
Yeah, for your listeners who don't spend every day thinking about the Farm Bill and the iterations that it goes through in Congress, I'd say they're probably living a lot happier lives than those that do.
What could be more enjoyable?
Congressional process, whatever it might be, is very mundane. And there are always long roads that legislation has to go through. And we are kind of in the beginning of a very long road. The House has their piece that they've passed. It's now time for the Senate, and we will probably learn pretty soon what the Senate Agriculture Committee and the leadership in the Senate has in mind for their version of what's included in budget reconciliation. I imagine it looks pretty different than what the House version is, not just on the numbers, but probably the policy that's included. The Senate also, again, not to use Jonathan's term of geeking out here, the Senate has very different rules on the type of legislation that can be included in budget reconciliation. Both Republicans and Democrats use budget reconciliation as a way to get around the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. You only need 50 votes plus one to get budget reconciliation passed. Now, because you have this special tool that you can use in the Senate, there are limitations on how you use it, known as the Byrd rule, right? And so you're going to hear this term called the Byrd bath that's going to come up here in the next couple of weeks, where the parliamentarian is going to look at this language and say, all right, does it actually impact revenue? Is this policy or is it spending? Because this is a budget. Budget should be about spending. It's not about changing policy. You have authorizing committees for policy. You have this whole other process to use policy changes. But if you want to talk about the budget and add a dollar here, subtract a dollar there, then we can include that, and be in line with the rules of the Senate. So one, I think there's a lot of fear being generated out there and enthusiasm on the other side about the House's legislation, their language, right? And I would say, just let's all take a beat and let senators do what senators have been elected to do, and then see what they come up with before we start saying, the something's on fire, where we start throwing a party, depending on your perspective. So there's a lot of iterations that have to go through still. And again, to Jonathan's earlier point, all members of Congress are concerned about feeding people who are in need. Like, they all are. And so when you deal with these large numbers, 2 or 3% change is a lot of money. And so you'll hear people talk about error rates in SNAP. You'll hear people talk about that. And that is a significant amount of money. You move that needle or that dial a little bit here or a little bit there. And that's a lot of money that's saved to either go back to taxpayers or to decrease our deficit, or is saved to be used elsewhere. I will also say, like, I don't think I'm saying anything too shocking, but maybe, like, it's not like these coalitions that we talk about, the farm coalition and the hunger community. It's not like there's regular meetings, and they all go into a room and they say, all right, here's our plan for the farm bill. And they come out and say, this is what the coalition agrees to. And this is our advocacy plan. This part of the coalition is going to go talk to these members. Man, I would have loved for that to have happened when Jonathan and I were up there having to, recommend positions to our bosses to take, but that's not how it is. And so there are times when you will find fractures within the coalition. That's probably all I should say about that until we get to our next 2 or 3 questions.
We're at this extraordinary moment in political life right now. Big changes are underway. A lot of disruption is happening at a scale that we really haven't seen, certainly not in my career. Western Landowners Alliance is a nonpartisan organization. We've got members from the entire political spectrum, from both extremes and a whole bunch in the middle, trying to find common ground, common sense policy to move us forward. But boy, people are having different reactions to what's happening on all kinds of different levels of federal policy change right now. So you've got a big part of our membership is excited to see change. We've needed change. The status quo has a lot of issues with it that we've been talking about for a long time, and it's hard to make change. So disruption sometimes is the way that you get change. For other people in the membership and across the West, the world looks like it's ending. A lot of bad things that come with change. Real mixed feelings across this whole spectrum of people. But the one thing that we've really focused on and that most people seem to agree on is, in a moment of disruption, there is opportunity to rethink how we're doing business, to see if we can do it better, to try to define the world we want to see on the other side of this and the pathways to getting there. And this can bring in new, fresh thinking and new, fresh coalitions and ideas that maybe have been sort of simmering on back burner for a while that have some merit. So I guess my question to both of you is, do you see some opportunities both for new coalitions to reshaping the Farm Bill and maybe for some new ideas or solutions to come forward that maybe haven't been able to emerge?
I don't know that I have an answer for what we do now. I think there is absolutely opportunities for new coalitions to be built, but I think we're going to have to face a lot of them here pretty soon. I imagine your listeners have heard of the MAHA movement, right? Or the movement, or however it's going to be described, to Make America Healthy Again. I think there is a lot of attention being paid to Secretary Kennedy, but not just him, not just Secretary Kennedy. Look at all of the influencers on social media who subscribe to this MAHA kind of position. Look at what elected officials are saying about Make America Healthy Again. And I'm not degrading the effort. I'm not minimizing the impact or the opportunity that they have. But when you look at the conversation online about it as well, you can just see there are more and more people paying attention to the Make America Healthy Again discussion. You've got a commission report that came out 2 or 3 weeks ago that had HHS and USDA and EPA all together making some statements about childhood health. And, we're going to have policy recommendations that come out in August. There are a growing number of people, I think Republicans and Democrats, out there in our constituencies who will probably have something to say about the way our food is grown. Probably have something to say about the way our food is made and manufactured. And I don't know that we have a good idea really of what that means. Does that transcend into future Farm Bill discussions? That MAHA kind of scope of policy underneath it, or potential policy underneath it, is pretty broad. So there is an opportunity for some coalition engagement with folks who haven't paid attention to the Farm Bill in the past. And so I think we need to be thinking about some of these new voices that might be coming into the discussion. And we got to figure out how to welcome them to the discussion, because, you want to really tick somebody off as you start excluding them, and they'll start banging on your door, whether you like it or not. And so I think there is opportunities moving forward within this time you mentioned of disruption.
Yeah, Jonathan, thoughts on that?
I think so. A couple things to this, and I always appreciate, like, Joel and it just brought me back a minute. The calming, I always like your calm perspective. That's the way. It's very good. He's very good at this. I don't know where it's headed or what, like how much legs it has under it and where it goes. But I do think, and this ties back a little bit to something you even asked before on subsidies, what we have seen, and I think farmers and farm interests struggle with this, and I think MAHA is kind of bringing, at least potentially bringing in the other side of this perspective, which is a real disconnect between us consuming food and the people out here who are producing that food, right? We've really kind of disconnected a lot over time. And I think that is to the detriment of both sides. I think it's a detriment to all of us, to farmers as well as consumers. I also think it can lead to really problematic policies, but it complicates the politics as well. And so this kind of brings us back in why anybody should care about the Farm Bill, because of its impact on the most fundamental things that we need to get through our day and to live, right? Food and water, and to some degree, even air. If I were being idealistic, I think I would see this silver lining as, oh, this is a moment where the consumer is going to get more engaged with food production. We're going to care a whole lot more about what happens from the farm through the food system to the grocery store aisle. I'm skeptical that we do get that level of depth into it, but I kind of hope we see more of that, because I think what farmers do is extraordinarily important, and the risk that's involved and the challenges that go into it are important. And we've allowed a lot of this to kind of be hidden in the system. I think there's some really tough questions that are being raised around the MAHA discussion. But I would say some similar aspects in terms of the coalitional kind of future or what else is out there. It is all the challenges we see in the natural resource world, the water, the land, what it looks like, how we've reshaped many parts of this country. What do we want it to look like as a society? Again, because what happens in a field doesn't just stay in a field. It actually impacts much beyond it. And we're seeing implications, we're seeing consequences of that, whether we want to talk about climate change or not, or we want to talk about strange weather patterns and difficult issues, or we want to talk about dust storms that hit highways and things like that. So there's a lot to this that has a lot around which we can build and rebuild coalitions or strengthen coalitions and think about how we all care about what happens here. But it's difficult. Even with the MAHA movement, like none of this is easy, right? There's not an easy button that I can have a grocery store full of every type of food I can possibly imagine, that is relatively inexpensive. I can get tomatoes in central Illinois in February, right? Like there's a lot of difficulties to make that happen. And there are consequences of that, whether that is a water use issue in Arizona to grow those tomatoes, whether that is the pest and disease sort of combating that goes into it. I don't think any of us want to consume pesticides, but we also want tomatoes without worms. So there's just a whole lot of challenges and complexities that go into it that I think get papered over. And there aren't easy solutions to this. And again, as sort of a history nerd, we've put a lot of time into how we are consuming and dealing with our food system today. It's built up over many, many years, and you're not going to reverse it overnight. Sometimes I get a little concerned, and I'm old enough that I'm grumpy about social media, so I will just take my social media anger and hold on to it tightly, that we really seem to oversimplify things on that kind of outlet. And it doesn't happen that easily. And so if this opens a conversation about a more resilient food supply, about better addressing natural resource challenges and issues, and more respect for what farmers do and more respect for what consumers want and need, then great that we have opened an important conversation. I don't see that being the conversation in Congress, and so I'm skeptical that we get there. And I don't know that this very social media type movement, digs in deep enough. But hey, something's got to start the conversation. I'm happy if this doesn't.
I think that's what we run into a great deal, really, is this oversimplification about these issues and people not really understanding what the logistical constraints are in many cases, what the economic constraints are. We all want a healthy food system. We all want a healthy environment. We all want clean water. There's not really disagreement in terms of the goals. We want a strong economy for this country. We want national security, all those things, quality of life. It's easy to create that kind of high level shared vision. But when it comes down to the brass tacks of actually growing the food, it's hard to do. It's hard to grow that food at an affordable price and get it delivered to the grocery store in a condition that the consumer is used to seeing. The choices we have to make as ranchers and farmers, land managers every day are all about these very complex trade-offs. One of the things I've noticed is that in a lot of our school systems today, we teach environmental studies, but we don't teach farming. We don't teach agriculture. We don't teach the other sides of these things that have to be considered together and understood. And we have a very small percentage of our population today that has any boots on the ground, real world experience anymore in agriculture and land management. I think that is feeding a lot, plus social media, into the dysfunction we're seeing at the political level. And I have no idea how we fix that, because that is a giant education piece for anybody that's involved in these discussions. So I know we're getting near the end here, but I did want to ask you guys two questions actually at the end. If you were going to write an entirely new farm bill today, what would stay the same? And is there anything major or structurally different that you'd want to see in the farm bill going forward? And I have one last question for you here, but let's start with that one. Joel, I'm going to pick on you.
I went first on the last question. So, if we were writing a new bill today, I think fundamentally, from a farmer and rancher's perspective, you have to have some sort of base level of support when things go wrong, right? When things are so far out of your control that there's nothing that you can do when Mother Nature strikes, or those pests and disease, when the plague comes, whatever it might be, there has to be that safety net there for our producers to stay in business. Unless the vast majority of Americans are okay with massive consolidation and an increase in other management practices that grow food, we're always going to grow food, right? It just depends on who do we want to grow it. Do we have more trust in a farm and ranch family to grow it, or do we have more trust in somebody else growing it? I would say we have to start with a safety net type of program or programs in place for us to move forward. I think if we're also need to be very, very conscious of if we want, a greater connection or understanding between food production and food consumption, we have to talk about that. We have to find a way to do that. And I don't think that public policy is the answer to all of society's ills. I really don't. If you want to screw something up, just give a blank sheet of paper to me and Jonathan Coppess, and then they'll sign that thing into law. Like, that is a good way to screw up our country. So, I think we have to look to some of these external organizations or conversations like the Farm Bureau family, for us to have that dialogue. When we talk about engaging new coalitions or new voices, like the first, we hear oftentimes like, oh, you got to tell your story. You got to tell your story, right? How many times have you heard that? How many times have your listeners heard that or been told that? You know what the best tool is when you're communicating with someone? Listening. Maybe instead of just telling our story and trying to ram that down people's throats, we start with listening. My old boss said very often, if you're explaining, you're losing. So if we're just telling our story, trying to explain our way into the hearts and minds of someone who has a particular belief or has seen some information that we don't like and now thinks that H2O is going to kill them, maybe we should start by listening to them and trying to understand what some of their concerns are. So I think if I'm starting from a blank sheet of paper on a farm bill, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a good old-fashioned listening tour where my boss would say, sit on the wagon tongue and not just talk to farmers and ranchers, but talk to some of these new voices who are now paying a lot more attention to our food supply and the regulatory system in which we get food and ingredients approved before we start writing some new stuff.
There's a lot to that I agree with. So I'll jump off in a direction in terms of, I have a lot of thoughts that we could meander for many minutes here. But I think in terms of the farm bill itself, if we're trying to rethink this policy, maybe blowing things up or whatever does sort of catalyze that rethinking. And I think it's very necessary. I'm not going to defend the status quo of any part of the farm bill at this point. I think there's a lot of challenges that have built up over time in that policy and a lot of things that could be rethought. And I will take sort of a page to prove that I learned a little bit in my time with Joel and former Chairman Roberts. There's a huge risk question throughout all of this that could really be the reorienting point around which we think about these policies. We talk about farmers and weather risk, and that's one part of it, but that's actually a very narrow sliver of what we need to think about in terms of policy and where the risks lie. What are the risks to soil, the risks to water, and so on and so forth? What are the resiliency type questions? And how do we rethink policies through that lens, right? I guarantee you, if we're worried about risk, we're not going to be making, to pick on a certain commodity, we're not going to be making $200 payments to one type of historic base record. And that would go from from weather risk at the farm field to risk to water to risk of hunger in communities and the challenges we see. One of the things I think that doesn't get talked about enough with food assistance is how many people work jobs and still can't afford to put food on the table. When we think about hollowed out rural communities where there's a lot of poverty and people struggling to get by, it's not just in the cities. To what Joel just brought up, what are the real risks of these substances we use to control pests? How do we manage that risk, and what are the risks to getting new things through to address new problems? Ultimately, I think that lesson where we have probably done the best with agriculture policy, it has been around that when we're looking at the risk a farmer faces. And if we apply that more broadly, I think we might find ourselves rethinking these policies and improving it. There's no way that 535 members of anything are going to get the right answer on any question. And I don't think we should expect that. I know we have low expectations in Congress. I don't think we should expect that out of Congress ever, no matter who's in charge and what their vote counts look like. We should look at, and this is another plug for the Farm Bill, one of the things that's done well is the 5-year relook. Every 5 years, you're reconsidering these things. The more we think in terms of evolutionary change, trying this, coming back and retrying that, or revising this because it didn't work, there's a lot of value in that. And frankly, I would argue that's the way the system was designed, was to try to force that slow evolutionary change and work to adapt. But again, that's very idealistic. That's not the moment we're in. That's not the policies we're looking at. And I think it's an unfortunate reality that what looks like maybe disruption and breaking is actually breaking some things and deeply entrenching others that are going to be a problem longer term. And so, yes, this could be that moment to listen better and come out with better ideas. I'm worried we're not seeing it. And I think the more, and this is where I kind of plug this little conversation, the more we have these conversations, maybe the better chance we have. The more we do listen to MAHA, even if you disagree with something about it. What is it they're trying? What are they frustrated with? What are they talking about beneath the surface? What's driving the concerns and how we dig into it? Maybe we get there.
Can I just say I appreciate Jonathan's comments, because what I heard when he spent all the time talking about risk is that he's such a fan of the crop insurance program that we need to make that the basis of our farm bill.
If we get those ratings right, Joel,
we got a little tweaking we can do. We'll be all right.
And it's no wonder it's the most popular program. And, farmers really, really want to see that thing work right. And it spans a lot of crops and regions. And you've seen the push from Senator Stabenow when she looked at this in 11 and 12, when she first became chair. She's like, this works great for corn. What's it doing for the vegetable crops in Michigan, the cherry producers and zucchinis and pickles? And so you saw her looking and pushing to make that program work for more farmers and more crops. And there's a reason for that, because it does have that kind of real world connection. And managing risk is something we all got to do. And it's definitely something farmers have to do. And it's not just managing risk in cotton country. It's managing risk on lettuce and tomatoes and cherries and apples. And so it is an important component and a way to think it through. So see, I learned, Joel.
Yeah, I would say crop insurance comes up a lot in discussions with Western producers. And there's a lot of attention, I think, that needs to be given to crop insurance and making sure that we've got it so that it's the right incentives, so that it's getting us to those outcomes that we're interested in seeing and not creating some unintended consequences, which is, I think, what a lot of people talk about when it comes to crop insurance. So that might be, a great opportunity to really take a hard look at what that's doing right now. So as a final question, what message would each one of you send to congressional leadership at this moment concerning the future of the Farm Bill or more broadly farm policy?
That's a great question. I guess I have to start, right? I mean, I would be concerned that there's not much listening going on to some of that, or listening not broadly enough. If I were to make some comments about where they should be thinking Farm Bill, I stick with my risk lens. But I would also throw in here, we need more voices in agriculture, to what you were saying, more people concerned about it, more people in that discussion. And if I'm worried about a sector of agriculture right now, it isn't the well-established farmer with all the base acres and the crop insurance and the LLCs and all of this. It's this early stage group of farmers. Like somebody who's been farming 20 years or less has been in a very different era of crop revenues and prices than what we may be entering. And I would caution doubling down on some of the policies we have now and rethinking, what does it mean not just next year, but for 20 years. What does it look like? Who are the farmers going to be around? What do they need to be successful over a longer term? So in that farm conversation, I would really push on that. And on the SNAP and food assistance side, I think we need to rethink. It's not a budget question. It's more of a question of why in this country, with all that we have, so many people struggle to put food on the table. So many kids go hungry. We're not having that conversation. We just got caught up in what can I hit with the budget hammer because it's a big number. And, the hunger situation, the food security questions around this country, I think deserve a lot more focus, attention, and listening, frankly. But again, I don't expect that to be heard too much.
I would say to any member of Congress or leadership, contact your State Farm Bureau and give them a call. And we always appreciate the opportunity to help guide you through those decisions that you have to make based off of our grassroots policy that's put in place as determined and decided upon by our members, real farmers and ranchers here across the state of Kansas. I echo some of what Jonathan said there. I don't want to echo everything that Jonathan said because it's not a wise decision. That would create a lot of risk in my life. About the need for other voices to be coming in. And I'd say my message isn't just to members of Congress, it'd be to your listeners as well. Y'all need to be making some phone calls or sending some emails or doing some, we don't call them tweets anymore. I don't know what we call them, social media posts or whatever it might be to let your voice be heard there as well. Not just, general pass a farm bill, yay, but, what is it that is important to you? When you look at research that's done around food, when you get past the safety issue, the number one thing that's important to consumers is price. And again, we got to say this, even in the midst of all of these interesting thoughts around the MAHA movement, we have the safest, most abundant food supply in the world, right? Our regulatory system is different than Europe's. It is different than other countries, and there's a reason for it. But the product speaks for itself. Like, we've got a safe and affordable, relatively affordable food supply, and that is of value. So if you value having that food supply, yeah, we should let our members of Congress know that that's important to us. And then the final thing I would say, got to end on a Roberts quote, right? Farmer and rancher would never put seed in the ground if they didn't have the faith and optimism to grow a good crop. I truly believe that about our government. Our voters, we are the farmers and ranchers in government. We are planting seeds in the ground with our votes for members of Congress and Senate and city council and school board and county commissions and everything. And each seed that we plant with our vote is critically important to our society. So please be thoughtful farmers when you're out there planting your seeds for your votes.
The way we need to engage with the broader public is going to be crucial, but I want to just underscore something that Western Landowners Alliance is built on, which is the land itself. And it does no good to have seeds if you don't have ground to put it in. And we are losing that ground. And every agricultural census shows continued loss of agricultural lands that is the resource that feeds us, clothes us, shelters us, that our national security is dependent on. We don't have international trade leverage. We don't have secure supply chains. We don't have all the things that we count on in this country if we don't have that land. And so this would just be a pitch for me to say that to congressional leadership, as you're building policies, you have got to ask the question, is this policy going to accelerate the loss of the lands that sustain us and the people who care for those lands? Or is it going to make sure that we have those lands there in the future? Which direction is this particular policy that you're embarking on going to take us? And I'd like to see more pass through that filter, because we talk a lot about the business of agriculture. We talk about trade policies and the economics and all of that, but really we're losing the land base. And that comes down to really fundamentally an economics question, which is a policy question. So how do we hold on to the land in which we plant those seeds? So that'll be my 2 cents to our congressional leadership. Jonathan, Joel, thank you so much for joining us today for this fantastic, informative conversation. You guys are amazing. I would love to see that kind of dialogue throughout our political system. I'd like to see you guys back in Congress. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yes, thanks for having us. It was fun.
Take care, y'all.
Thanks again to Joel and Jonathan for joining us today. You can learn more about these fellas and their work in the show notes, which you can find by heading over to onland.link/podcast. If you're on Spotify or Apple, there should be a link as well in the description of this episode. On Land is a production of Western Landowners Alliance, a West-wide organization of landowners, natural resource managers, and partners dedicated to keeping working lands whole and healthy for the benefit of people and wildlife. This episode was hosted by Lesli Allison, produced by Louis Wirtz, and edited by Zach Altman and Kathleen Shannon. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it. Share it with a friend or a neighbor, and leave a review on Apple or Spotify if you're on there. Your support really helps us amplify the show and the voices of stewardship in the American West. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.